Come on in. Come on in. Hey, doing good, Hansi. How are you? 8:59, 58, 59, 9. Oh, it is so good to see you all here today. I'm thankful for everybody to be here. 0900, that's right. When I was a chaplain, we had a clock in the room behind where you walk out for the front, and it was linked to the clock in the sanctuary. And when that second hand swept the 0900 hours, we opened the door and walked out. I mean, it was just that precise every single Sunday. So I just got it as part of my DNA. I'm sorry. It's great to be here today with you. I'm so thankful for the opportunity, whether you're here in person or whether you're with us online. I am appreciative of your taking time to be here today. I'd like to begin with a word of prayer, and I have the privilege of leading the prayer in our sanctuary this morning, our time of worship. And so I'm going to spend time when we approach God this morning as a congregation, talking and thinking about asking God's blessings on the families that have been so affected by the terrible floods. And so it's not that I'm remiss in remembering that. I certainly want to do that. But for the purpose of our class this morning, I just wanted to go back to Psalm 9 and use that as a basis for an introduction to our lesson today. And so if you would, bow with me and go to God in prayer. Oh, Father God, we come before you today with hearts that are filled with praise for you, telling everyone about your wonders. Father, you have walked with us, you have judged righteously, you have destroyed the wicked and upheld the oppressed and those who trust in you. Father, you reign forever, and you govern with justice, and you've never forsaken those who seek you. And so, Father, this morning we ask for you to have mercy on us and to deliver us, and to never let the hope of the afflicted perish. For we ask these things through the name of Christ. Amen. So, with that in mind, I have on the board here a quick outline of where we're going today. We're going to do a quick review, talk about some issues of credibility. Then we're going to turn to the prophets to begin our section in Romans today. And then we're going to talk about Paul's speech or talk to the Jewish population of the church there in Rome. And so we're going to take a look at how they relied on knowledge, tradition, and ritual in their approach to God. And we're going to talk about some of the problems with that approach. We're also going to look at the way that they outline their mission and what Paul has to say about that. And then some of the things that are of particular importance as we read through this text. Just hear these words echo in your mind as we come to them. The words superior or knowledge or truth or blaspheme or circumcision. And all those were terms I hope that we will be able to cover in our discussion today. So as we begin, we've been approaching the book of Romans. We started this study several weeks ago. Carl introduced us. Took 3 weeks to introduce us to the text and to get us through the first 17 chapters and talking about the gospel that Paul had hoped to bring to and talk about in this essay of his to the church in Rome, where he had never been before. He didn't know. And so we talked a little bit about the importance of this letter in Christian history. We talked about who it was written to, the population of that church there. And then that first week that I got to teach with the second half of chapter 1, we went to the wisdom literature. We went to Proverbs chapter 1, and we talked about how in Proverbs 1, the wisdom of God calls out to all the earth. And unfortunately, people reject that wisdom. And so the wisdom that then is kind of the foundation, I thought, of much of what he had to say to the Gentiles. And as he went through the end of chapter 1, if you're a Jew in Rome, what would you be saying to Paul? We've been through this many times already, the last several weeks. What would you be saying to Paul? Preach on, brother. You got it. them old Gentiles, they have it coming, right? They're living this horrendous lifestyle that's rejected God. They're in fact, some of the words are, God gave them over, to the sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, to shameful lusts. He talks about this list of sins of wickedness, evil, greed, depravity, and on and on and on. No love, no faithfulness, no understanding, no mercy. This is how the description of the Gentile world, in the words of Paul, was like. And we talked for a moment about how in the ancient world, it was a harsh world. Life had very little value. People would just, they'd slit your throat for almost nothing. Babies were just left out to die, just on and on. So this was the Gentile world, and the Jews saw themselves as above that, right? And we learned last week in chapter 2, verses 1 through 17, or 1 through 16, excuse me, about some of the ways that the Jews saw themselves, some of the presuppositions that they had. So how did the Jews see themselves? As a review quickly from last week, they saw themselves as chosen people, right? They were God's own people. So how could God judge them, right? I mean, they were God's people. So that was one presupposition that they came to life with. Okay, they were righteous. They had the law, and so they were informed. They knew better than to live the kind of lifestyle that the Gentiles were living, and so they were righteous people. They avoided those kinds of things, idolatry and whatnot. All right. So how else did they see themselves? Oh, okay. So we're going to talk about that today, a lot about that. They were trusting in some of the signs, the rituals that they participated in as making them right with God. This is what it took. You just got to be born in the right family, and then you're okay. And as long as you followed the rituals, then you're right on track. So this was kind of the background. And last week we also explored, as we went into this text where he turns the attention from the Gentile world to the Jewish world, I went back to Exodus, if you remember, to the Torah. And I talked about Exodus 34, verses 5 through 7, which is you remember, the most important text in the Hebrew Bible is found in the second book of the Bible, chapter 34, verses 5 through 7. And if you can count to 7, you can memorize that. And you got that text. And it's the text that talks about God being gracious and slow to anger and abounding in love. And yet, remember at the end of that, yet, he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He is a just God, a righteous God, a holy God. And so, based on that, we see that he kind of goes back, he refers, I think, in many ways to that as he talks about, for example, in chapter 2 and verse 2, now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth, and we talked about knowledge and truth and his judgment being based on that last week. And then he starts getting a little bit more pointed in verse 5 when he says, you are storing up wrath for yourselves, against yourself, for the day of God's wrath. And that concept of the day of God's wrath, we start to realize, he's not talking about just those who are lawbreakers. He's talking about Jews. Because in the ancient world, who had a concept of judgment? Did the Romans? No. Did the Greeks? No. It was the Jewish people. And so the storing up wrath on the day of God's wrath, this idea of God bringing judgment to the world, is something that the Jews would have been, wait a minute, now you're talking about us. It's kind of slowly sinking in. And today, as we get to verse 17, we're going to realize he is very explicit in identifying now it is the Jews he's talking to. And so, but he slowly brings it on in that first half of chapter 2 so that they realize that it's God is going to bring them to an account as well as the Gentile world. And here's that phrase last week. We didn't really have time to talk about it, but this phrase, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. Does that mean God is showing partiality? What is God okay, I see head shaking. No. Why? What does this mean? First for the Jew and then for the Gentile. Why would Paul kind of bring that notion out?
There's a promise in place.
Okay, there's a promise in place. All right. First for the Jew and then for the Gentile. All right. So there's a promise in place. It's also, I might say, this broader idea that the more we've been given, the more responsible we're going to be. And so as people are looking at life, we need to be realizing that it's these things are going to apply. First for the Jew, who has these great privileges, if you would, of having been given the law, having been given the prophets, and et cetera, et cetera. But then also even for the Gentile, for God does not show favoritism, is how he ends in verse 11. And then in verses 12 through 16, we talked about how verse 16 actually follows directly on from verse 12. And verses 13 through 15 are kind of a parenthetical statement where he kind of talks about those who are under the law will be judged by the law, for it is not those who hear the law who are righteous, but those who obey who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. So what is that? And I mentioned this just almost briefly at the very end of class last week. What does that mean when we say that Gentiles know by nature to do certain things of the law? Does that mean we know by nature that we ought to be circumcised? I don't think so. We know by nature that we're supposed to sacrifice a certain sacrifice on the Passover every year. I don't think we know that by nature. So what is it by nature that we know? Okay, God's moral law. Yeah, exactly right. There is something within us. We've been made in the image of God so that there's just something in the human heart that knows right from wrong. Some foundational kinds of things. Some of the basic things of life. It's just within us. And so it's been made, that's the way God made us. And so by nature, when those who are Gentiles do what is required or what is right by the law, then they are a law for themselves, even though they don't have a law. And they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. And the conscience, remember last week, bears witness to this. And I talked about the conscience being kind of like a one-way street. It can tell us when we're wrong, but it can't always tell us when we're right. And so this conscience sometimes will accuse them, other times defend them, and this will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. And so here again is that day of judgment, which would have been unique to the Jewish people. And then now in verse 17, so there's no question about who he's talking about. He says, now you, if you call yourself who? A Jew. If you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you're convinced, and he goes on to be a guide, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So he turns his attention. There's no question now. He is talking to the Jewish people, the Jewish part of that congregation. And he's bringing to bear this idea that's going to culminate in chapter 3 and verse 23, where he says, for all have sinned and what? Fallen short of the glory of God. Exactly. And that's where he's headed. That's where he's going. So he's already shown the Gentiles live in a fallen world and are fallen because they've rejected God, even though they had the creation around us declares his eternal power and his divine nature. The Jews have the law of God, but have they kept it? No, they haven't kept it. And so they're lawbreakers also. And so they're going to be under judgment as well. And so now he's making it clear that both segments of society are under judgment. So what is it then? And he's going to, as he enters into this discussion about the Jews in the section we're going to cover today, he's going to talk about the fact that there's a problem. Because of the sin of the Jewish nation, people have turned their back on God. Other nations have looked at the Jews and said, well, if that's the way it is, then I don't believe in your God. They blaspheme God. So what does it mean to be a credible witness to God? Well, let's talk about that first in terms of the Jewish world and then in terms of our world. In terms of the Jewish world, what would it have meant for the Jewish people to have been really credible witnesses to the rest of the world? To accomplish this mission right here. Oh, Kevin? Oh, okay. If they kept the law, that would have made them a credible witness, right? So keeping the law, what other ways might we frame that? So that's okay, in light of the prophets. All right. So okay, so all right, living a life that is distinct from the world around them. They don't put out their babies to die, right? They take care of the poor. They take care of the widow. They take care of the oppressed. They're concerned for the least of these. And so so they keep the law in light of the prophets. They live a moral life. What is it about? So let's talk about us. What makes us a credible? Let's not do that. All right. I'm bringing it home today. All right. What makes us credible witnesses in our world?
People see us, they should know something about God.
Okay. When people see us, they should know something of what God is like, Brent says. I think that's a good way of putting it. So when they see us, what they ought to see is Christ reflected in our lives. And that makes for a credible witness. What happens when we violate the law, if you would, or don't live a moral life? What does the world say? Hypocrites. How many of you have talked to someone in your world, family members, coworker, friend? Oh, you church people, you're no different than the world. Why should I bother? I see hands going up. Every one of us have, I'm sure. That's a real problem. It wasn't just a problem for the Jewish people. This is a human problem. It's a problem in our world. It's a problem with the church. And we struggle with this. We want to be credible witnesses. We want to live a life that is distinct and different and reflects God's glory and follows Jesus. But it doesn't always happen. Sometimes there's individuals who blatantly disregard God's ways and gives God a black eye, so to speak, in the world's eyes. So that is kind of the direction that we're headed. Judaism, the Jewish nation, has not been a credible witness, and so today he's going to talk about what needs to happen instead. Okay, there's a union of exactly. There's a union between practice and doctrine. There can't be a separation. When we begin to think that, oh, well, we know God's will, we have it all down. We know that it's supposed to be on Sunday morning 3 songs and a prayer, and if you do any other way, then by golly, you're wrong. If we have that, if we're depending on strict knowledge, but then we leave on a Sunday morning, we leave and we walk through the rest of the week and live any way we want to live, then there's not that union between orthodoxy, our understanding of God's nature and His will, and how we live that out. There's got to be a union between those two. Failure leads to being an uncredible or a non-credible witness. So let's turn, before we read any further in our text, let's turn to the prophets. Speaking of the prophets, because I've quoted from the writings, Proverbs 1 as a basis for chapter 1, the last half. I've quoted from the Torah last week from Exodus and talking about the beginning of chapter 2. Now let's turn to and I've selected just one, not randomly per se, but just one out of a multitude that we could have gone to. I'd like for us to go to Micah chapter 3. Micah is a book that has a number of oracles. It'll go back and forth between hope oracles and oracles of doom. And what we see here in chapter 3 is a doom oracle. And he's going to be kind of coming to a conclusion. And so we're only reading kind of a conclusion here. But I want to just read a couple verses. Hear this, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of Israel, who despise justice and distort all that is right. Here's that failure of orthopraxy, right? That practice. He says, who build Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with wickedness. Her leaders judge for a bribe. Her priests teach for a price. And her prophets tell fortunes for money. Yet they look for the Lord's support. And they say, is not the Lord among us? No disaster will come upon us. Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, and the temple hill a mound overgrown with thickets. That's a pretty rough prophecy, isn't it? Doom oracle. What he's saying is that in his day and age, these leaders had disregarded justice and concern for the poor and things that God had prioritized. And even though they had their lineage, even though they had their temple worship, even though they had all the rituals and they had the law and everything else, that wasn't going to do a thing for them because they disregarded God's ways. They were not obedient to living a life that was distinct and different. And so, there's other passages. There's passages in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all through the prophets, Amos, so many passages. But I just chose that one as a beginning point for us to think about the harsh judgment that will come upon those who are trusting in things like their knowledge of the law. All right. So let's continue with the reading of today's text. I stopped off in verse, I read through verse 18. Would someone read for me verses 19 through 24? 19 through 24 of Romans chapter 2.
If you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have the law, the embodiment of knowledge and truth. You then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you.
All right. So what does he say here about the Jewish people? How do the Jews consider themselves? What do they think of themselves being? What's their mission? All right, they're to be a guide for the blind. Is that a bad thing? No. Good. They're to be a light for those who are in the dark. Is that a bad thing? Are they to be instructors for those who lack knowledge, who are foolish? Sure. Yeah, that being an instructor is a good thing. How about a teacher of little children, of infants and on up? Should we just let the infants just wallow? No, we're supposed to nurture them, right? Bring them up. So what's the problem? I mean, that's good stuff. All right, well, number one, they're not doing it, at least not very well. All right, so that's a part of it. Because they're not doing it, he gets blasphemed. Instead of them following this mission, what is this attitude of theirs led to? I've written the word on the board. Oh, arrogance. You have a good guess. Yeah, arrogance. It's led to the sin of arrogance. I am glad that we don't have that problem. All right? Of course, I see smiles. That's not true. And, when we think about, I think about Paul's words, let there not be many teachers among you, because those who teach are going to be held to an even greater level of responsibility for what they say. And I shake sometimes. I really am, very concerned that I don't say something that would be inappropriate.
So this to me is a little bit of the Jew first and then the Gentile. The students, so to speak, don't get it. That means the teachers are not doing their job.
Okay. The Jews have this great advantage of having the law, of having been given the prophets, of having the word of God. And they're supposed to use that word in ways that are profitable for the world. But if they don't, if the students are failing, then the teacher's failing. And they're not accomplishing what God intended them to do. So, as the church, what does God intend for us to do? Oh, you want me to step over here again? We're to be a guide for the blind. We're to be light for the dark. We're to be instructors of those who lack. We're to be people who are nurturing and instructing and bringing up little ones. Okay. What else does God intend? All these things, absolutely. How would we? That's a great way to put it in words of Scripture. How about in just everyday language? What does God intend for the church to be doing? An example to the world, the hands and feet of Jesus, okay? We're to be with Jesus so that we can become like Jesus, so that we can do as Jesus did by the power of the Holy Spirit, okay? Yeah, so following after Jesus, being the hands and feet of Jesus, being an example. Other ways of describing the intent of God for the church. Okay, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? Okay, yeah, we've got good news. We've got the best news of the world to share. I mean, what could keep, when you get good news, you just typically go back into your bedroom and shut the door? No, you flip open your phone, right? You start hitting Facebook pages. Hey, look at what happened here. This is great news. The birth of a grandchild, right, Leslie? Or you have a graduation or some accomplishment that's been achieved. Wonderful news deserves to be proclaimed.
The Old Covenant and the New Covenant, there's one concept of the law and gospel. God gives us the law. For to keep that, and if someone's perfect, theoretically, then there's no need for God. Of course,
but
when we haven't kept the law, the question arises: am I hopeless? Am I left in despair? That's when the gospel comes in.
Yes.
We haven't kept the law, and we haven't.
Yes.
Told the truth.
Yeah.
We haven't.
Exactly. The standard of what Paul has laid out here in chapter 2 is the standard for being right with God is perfection. And we all raised our hand last week when I asked who is perfect. Right? So obviously we're not. And so that good news is that we're not left in despair. We have, because of what Jesus has done for us, we have great news, not only for our lives, but for the world.
Back to that word you wrote, arrogance. We're not to be arrogant when we're doing these things.
Yes.
Because the message is This is from us
Yeah.
to make you right with God. This is from God to make all of us right.
Yeah.
That we need it as much as you.
That's right.
We want to share with you what we have from God.
And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is sharing, look what God has done in my life. He has turned me around from despair to hope. Okay. Okay. God intends on us, yeah, to share that gospel and to share it in humility, because we know that we ourselves are in just every bit as much of need of that news as anyone in our world is in need of it. And so we have this great news that we don't want to keep to ourselves. We want to spread it out to the world. We want to share it in humility, in a way that they can see that God has good news for them as well as for us. So these are all good things, but we fail at them. And so there's that need for, and he's going to come down to that obviously in Romans, the need for the gospel, because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so what is he telling that he says very specifically now in this section, this paragraph, you call yourself a Jew, right? If you have if you know his will, approve what's superior. But by the way, what is it? What is superior? What is that? What's superior? What does superior show? Insinuate? Okay. Well, it could lead to arrogance, but if you're talking about something that is superior, you're inferring that it's better, that there's something that's inferior. Yeah. There are distinctions, right? Not everything's the same. There is such a thing as universal truths. That's a word that our world will, what? Look at you and that's not right. That's not what I've been taught. We're all the same. It just depends. But there are some things that make a difference. There's superior things and inferior things. And the ways of God are superior to the ways of the world. It's just that simple, really, if you want to look at it that way. And so if you know that, though, if you approve of what is superior, because you're instructed by the law, if you're convinced that you're all these things, right, then why does the nations blaspheme God? Because we're not keeping it. We're not keeping it. Oh, okay.
The more the Jews boast of their privileged position and special rights, while at the same time failing to obey his will, the more those who do not know God despise him.
Okay, that's a great quote. Is that from our?
That's Fismeyer.
Oh, okay, that's a separate. I wasn't privy to that, or I would have probably used it. But that's a good one. That's a good quote. So, and this, by the way, is not something that's unique to the Jews of Paul's age. Where does that idea come from? It's a quote from Isaiah. Yeah. You can go back hundreds of years, and the Jews were having the same problem hundreds of years before. So this is not something that is unique just to the church in Rome, or even, I might say, just to Jews by themselves. It's among God's people even today. This happens, and now we're going to move then. I was going to say this too. There in verse 20, there's something here. You have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. Last week we paused for a moment to talk about what knowledge is and what truth is, but what a claim! Think about that. In the law of God is the embodiment of knowledge and truth. So oftentimes we just kind of read those texts and skip over it. It's well worth our time to meditate on that and to think about what that means. Yes, sir.
week, a good friend of mine texted me a little quote. He said, knowledge learned and wisdom.
Applies?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, it goes on to say, truth. Truth is absolute. There is an absolute truth.
Yes, there is absolute truth, and wisdom applies knowledge. So it's not just enough to have knowledge, to know things. It's the idea of putting it into practice, of heeding that call of wisdom that stands on the street corner calling out, like the Proverbs 1 says. So the Jews have this mission, but instead of fulfilling it, it led to the sin of arrogance. And so now the question becomes, how is it that that this is gonna be overcome? And Paul accuses the Jews of, first of all, committing adultery, or, well, he says, you who say that you should not steal, do you steal? Should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? Now, did all the Jews commit adultery? Were they all committing adultery with each other? Well, not everybody. Obviously, they're holy people amongst the Jewish people. There's lots of people, but there was still some. There were some who were involved in sins, even as sins that might be described in the Ten Commandments. Don't steal, don't commit adultery, and yet there was still some violation of that going on. But then there was this kind of strange one. You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? What is that about? What is robbing a temple? Oh, okay. I've read several different understandings of this passage. That was one particular idea, that they weren't giving back to God all that they ought to have given. Okay, so that's one idea that I read. I'm still fishing though. So what other things might come to mind when you think about robbing temples? If you abhor idols, do you rob temples?
One thing that I read in the book, I think
Yes.
they would take idols out of temples and then go out and sell them to
Yeah.
people so
Okay.
they could worship them.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to bring. I read that, and I was not familiar with that, and so I started looking at that, and oh, well, that makes a lot of sense for this passage. If you abhor idols, but then profit from idols, selling trinkets or whatever, you're participating, if you would, in that, and so you're violating the very basic command of do not commit idolatry. So there's this very foundational issues that they were breaking in these verses here. And so now the attention goes from knowing the law and yet not keeping it to religious rituals and traditions, and kind of going to that as their safety point. So it says circumcision has value if, there's the big word, 2 letters, if you observe the law. But if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, that harkens back to that verse we read just a few moments ago in our review, when we talked about the Jews or the Gentiles who are keeping the requirements of the law that are written on their hearts, right? So if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, that is the physical mark, you who are a lawbreaker. So what has Paul just said? Oh, okay. Well, he's gonna say that in a kind of a roundabout way here. He's going to say that very plainly in other places in his letters. It's of no regard. It has no place, you might say, in terms of salvation, right? There's no place in salvation. It doesn't save one just because you have that physical mark in your body as a male. So then, why does he say that circumcision has value. How could it have value if it's got no place in
It remains a sign.
okay, it remains a sign of the covenant. All right. It is keeping God's commands. All right, go ahead. Yeah.
Verse 5 says, the circumcision is of value if you obey the law.
If you obey the law. Okay. Yeah.
That's why Adam and Eve had to
One commission. The one was all it took to be a lawbreaker. That's right. And so if you keep the law, then circumcision has value. It's also, again, a sign of the covenant. It's also something that's been commanded. So, I mean, if you want to be obedient, then you're going to be following after those commands. But this was a ritual, if you would. It's a tradition. It's something that has value in conjunction with observing the law. But when we try to put our trust in these ritual things while at the same time not obeying the law, then what position does that put us in? In trouble. Inferior. Okay, yeah, we go from superior to inferior. Yeah, we it puts us in trouble. And so even those who are not physically circumcised, if they're obeying the law by what's written on their hearts, they're going to look at you and they're going to condemn you. All right, they're going to be able to look at you and say, "Well, I'm doing better than you are." I've got a quote. So it's not circumcision. I have written in my notes here. It's not circumcision of the flesh that sets a person apart, but it's keeping the law's requirements. Even the one who is uncircumcised, if they keep the law, will be reckoned as right. Paul must have in mind the moral commands of the law once again, rather than the ritual components of Judaism. I was going to read this passage. I'm going to read from this text or this book. It's by Annie Dillard. Reflects the mercy and grace of God, the good news that even though we struggle, God reaches down and accepts us and loves us as we turn our lives over to Him. So she writes, a high school stage play is more polished than this service we have been rehearsing since year one. In 2,000 years, we have not worked out the kinks. We positively glorify them. Week after week, we witness the same miracle, that God, who is so mighty that he can stifle his own laughter. Week after week, we witness the same miracle, that God, for reasons unfathomable, refrains from blowing our dancing bear act to smithereens. Week after week, Christ washes the disciples' dirty feet, handling their very toes, and repeats, it's all right, believe it or not, to be people. God's grace continues to reach out to us even as we struggle with ourselves, with our approach to God, with our circumcision keeping and all the different things that we're attempting to do. So, I was going to also read as we finish these verses here. Let's finish the text, and then I'm going to have to hurry up and finish. It says, where did I leave off? Verse 27, right? Okay, verse 28. A person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. This reminds me, of course, of several passages in the Old Testament. One comes from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 36, in verse 26. Ezekiel says, I will give you, quoting God, he says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people, and I will be your God. So, and he goes on to talk about saving them from their uncleanliness and other things. But this idea of a new spirit, a new heart of flesh. So what is it in this passage that Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 2, where he says one's not a Jew if one's a Jew only outwardly? What marks a true person of God? Oh, okay, you read my note. What God is looking for is a broken and contrite heart, the psalmist says in Psalm 51, right? Oh God, do not despise me, but rather, I have a broken and contrite heart. Psalm 51 is one of those psalms that I've gone back to in my own life on many occasions. And you reread this over and over again. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, O God, will not despise. And so we're reminded once again of what God is looking for in our lives. So the real Jew is one whose heart is circumcised, not just a physical circumcision, but one whose heart is seeking and searching after God.
Like, Mark, if I put on a karate master's black belt, that doesn't mean I'm a karate master. I mean, it's an outward sign, right?
Yes.
And a karate master, if he doesn't have the black belt, can still do all the things I can't do. It's not the outward sign, right?
Yeah.
Similar.
That's right.
Inward.
It's the inward ability, not ability, but the inward approach to God of giving God everything and trusting in Him for all. So, William?
In Micah, after the prophet condemned Israel for their lack of justice, for the way they mistreated disenfranchised, in chapter 16, he tells them the solution. Justice, kindness, and walk humbly
with your God.
The heart is one of submission, not of arrogance.
Yeah. Amen. And so with that, we have completed chapter 2 of Romans. The wrath of God has been thoroughly explained. Nobody has any more questions, and we're going to move on next week into chapter 3. And I don't know who's following me. Oh, Carl's going to be following me. So I appreciate your attention. Thank you.